Good evening, pals. Glad to see you. In the previous video, we listened to a long story of Chinese history. Now turn the volume a bit louder. Prepare yourself a cozy blanket and join me in the rest journey into one of the oldest countries in the world. But first take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy the story. And as always, tell me where you are listening from tonight and what time it is where you are in the comment below. Let's go. The Spring and Autumn World. The name of the next age sounds gentle. Spring and autumn. It brings to mind the turning of seasons, the soft return of green after winter, the fading gold of leaves before cold winds arrive. But the world behind that name was far from still. After the Western Zhou collapsed and the royal court moved east to Luoyang, the old center of power remained only in a thinner form. The Zhou king still existed. He still carried the title Son of Heaven. Rituals were still performed in his name, and the memory of the mandate of heaven still gave him a sacred place in the imagination of the age. Yet, beyond the walls of his court, real power was now scattered among the regional states. The king had become a symbol of unity in a world that was no longer truly united. This period, known as the Spring and Autumn period, lasted from 770 to 476 BCE. Its name comes from the Spring and Autumn Annals, a chronicle associated with the state of Lu. The title is simple, almost modest, but the centuries it describes were full of rivalry, diplomacy, war reform, and restless searching. It was an age when the old rituals of Zhou still mattered, but could no longer hold the world together by themselves. At the beginning of this era, the Zhou realm was divided among many states. Some were large and powerful. Others were small, vulnerable, and dependent on stronger neighbors. More than 100 political units existed in one form or another each, with its own ruling house territory, local loyalties, and ambitions. Some traced their legitimacy back to old Zhou grants. Some stood on the edges of the Zhou cultural world. Some were deeply rooted in the Central Plains, while others occupied frontier regions where different peoples, customs, and languages met. The map was alive with motion. States made alliances, broke them, attacked rivals, absorbed weaker neighbors, and sought advantage through marriage, diplomacy, trade, and military action. The Zhou king still offered ritual recognition, but he could no longer command obedience as earlier kings had done. Lords might still claim to act in his name, but the real question was no longer what the king wanted. It was which state had enough strength, wealth, and skill to shape events. And yet, the old order did not disappear completely. This is what makes the Spring and Autumn's period so interesting. It was not pure chaos. It was a world caught between two ways of living. On one side stood the memory of Zhou ritual, hierarchy, ancestral ceremony, noble conduct, and the idea that rulers should behave according to proper forms. On the other side stood the growing reality of competition, stronger states expanding weaker states, disappearing, and rulers learning that survival required more than beautiful ceremonies. War in this period still carried traces of aristocratic restraint. Noble houses understood one another through shared rituals and rank. Envoys traveled between courts. Treaties were made. Hostages were exchanged. Battles could still be framed as matters of honor, punishment, or restoration of proper order. Chariots remained important symbols of elite warfare, carrying noble warriors across the field with drivers and attendants. Before campaigns, rulers might sacrifice to ancestors or consult omens. Even violence still moved at times under the shadow of ceremony. But the ground beneath that ceremony was changing. War was becoming more frequent. Strong states began to consume smaller ones. Military success became a path to prestige. Territory mattered more sharply because territory meant fields, people, tribute, and soldiers. The lords who could organize resources well gained advantage over those who relied only on old status. Slowly, the age of inherited rank was making room for the age of practical ability. For ordinary people, these changes were felt in quiet and difficult ways. A village might belong to one lord in one generation and fall under another state in the next. Men could be called away for military service. Farmers might be asked to provide more grain, more labor, or more transport for campaigns. Roads that once connected markets and kin could become routes for marching troops. In times of peace, the fields returned to their familiar rhythm. But in unsettled years, political ambition entered the household through taxes, conscription, and uncertainty. Still, daily life continued. The seasons did not stop because lords were competing. Millet still had to be planted in the north. Rice still had to be tended in the wetter south. Families still repaired roofs, fed animals, honored their dead, and watched the weather. Children still learned by watching older hands work. The sound of grinding grain, the smell of cooking, the creak of wooden carts, and the murmur of evening conversation remained part of the human world beneath the movements of states. This contrast gives the period its quiet depth. Above, rulers negotiated and fought. Below, people tried to keep life going. The strongest states gradually became more than ordinary vassals. They became powers capable of leading coalitions and influencing the wider political world. These leading rulers were later called hegemons. They did not replace the Zhou king as emperors. Instead, they claimed to protect him, defend the civilized order, and maintain balance among the states. In practice, this allowed them to exercise authority while still respecting the symbolic position of the Zhou royal house. The first great hegemon was Duke Huan of Qi. The state of Qi lay in the east near the coast, in a region rich with resources such as salt and fish. Under Duke Huan and his famous minister, Guanzhong Qi became wealthy, organized, and powerful. Guanzhong is remembered as a practical reformer who strengthened administration, encouraged economic development, and helped turn Qi into a leading state. Under their leadership, Qi called together alliances of other states claiming to defend the Zhou king and resist outside threats. This was a new kind of power. Duke Huan did not need to call himself king of all. He could present himself as the protector of the old order while benefiting from the weakness of that same order. He honored the Zhou framework, but he also showed that real leadership had shifted away from the royal court and into the hands of powerful regional rulers. Other hegemons followed in later generations. The state of Jin rose in the north and became one of the major powers of the Central Plains. Chu expanded from the south, bringing a different cultural flavor and enormous territorial strength. Qin in the west was still growing, hardened by frontier life and destined for a future far greater than anyone might yet expect. Wu and Yue in the southeast would rise later, showing that the political world was expanding beyond the old heartland. Each state had its own character. Qi was wealthy and open to trade. Jin was powerful in the north and deeply involved in interstate rivalry. Chu was vast southern and sometimes seen by central states as only partly within their cultural world, though its influence would become immense. Xian stood on the western frontier, disciplined by conflict with neighboring peoples and by the demands of survival in a rugged region. Wu and Yue looked toward rivers, wetlands, and southeastern landscapes that earlier Zhou elites had once considered distant. The spring and autumn world was therefore not simply a broken Zhou kingdom. It was a widening Chinese world. Different regions entered the story more strongly. Local traditions mixed with Zhou ritual culture. States learned from one another even as they fought. Envoys carried messages, marriage alliances linked ruling houses, merchants moved goods across borders, and wandering specialists offered advice to courts willing to listen. As rulers competed, they needed talent. This need began to loosen the old aristocratic order. Birth still mattered greatly, but it was no longer enough. A ruler who wanted to survive had to find capable ministers, military leaders, diplomats, administrators, and advisors. Men of skill could rise higher than before if they proved useful. The court became not only a place of inherited privilege, but also a place where intelligence and strategy could shape policy. This shift would have enormous consequences. It helped prepare the way for the great intellectual flowering that followed. When the old order weakened, people began asking what should replace it. When rituals no longer guaranteed harmony, thinkers began searching for deeper principles. When rulers needed advice, teachers and persuaders traveled from court to court, offering visions of order. But before the age of philosophy fully opens, we should stay a little longer inside the spring and autumn world itself. It was a world of courts and fields, bronze vessels and wooden plows, ancestral halls and frontier camps. A lord might preside over a ceremony in the morning and plan a campaign in the evening. An envoy might travel for days to deliver a message that could prevent war or prepare one. A minister might argue that a ruler should reduce burdens on the people, not because of kindness alone, but because a prosperous population made the state stronger. Practical thinking was growing. The old Zhou ideal had emphasized ritual harmony. In the spring and autumn period, harmony still mattered, but rulers increasingly had to think about grain reserves, population, military organization, tax systems, roads, fortifications, and alliances. A state that managed these things well could survive. A state that failed could become dependent, divided, or absorbed. The pressure of competition made governments more serious. Some states began improving administration, some strengthened legal codes, some reorganized land and military obligations. These reforms were not yet as sweeping as those of the later warring states period, but the direction was clear. Political survival demanded structure. The lord who ruled only through inherited prestige was becoming less secure than the lord who could count households, command soldiers, store grain, and reward service. At the same time, the moral language of the Zhou did not vanish. Rulers still spoke of duty, virtue, and loyalty. Ministers still warned against arrogance. Chronicles recorded not only events, but judgments. A ruler who violated ritual norms could be criticized. A lord who betrayed trust could be remembered with shame. Even in a competitive age, people still believed that power should have moral limits. This tension gave the period its human drama. Ambition pulled one way, ritual memory pulled another. A ruler wanted more land, but he also wanted to appear righteous. A state wanted military advantage, but it still sought legitimacy. A minister might serve a powerful lord, yet speak in the language of duty and restraint. The world had not abandoned morality. It had become uncertain about how morality could survive politics. The state of Lu, where the spring and autumn annals were preserved later, became especially associated with Confucius. Lu was not the strongest of the states. It did not dominate the age like Chu or Qin. But it preserved old Zhou ritual traditions with unusual care. For that reason, it became an important symbolic home for later thinkers who looked back to Zhou order as a model of proper conduct. In a place like Lu, one can imagine the contrast clearly. The rituals are still performed, ancestors are honored, the correct forms are remembered. Yet news keeps arriving from other states. A lord defeated a treaty, broken a small state, annexed a powerful minister, challenging his ruler, a campaign forming on the frontier. The old songs still sound in the halls, but outside the age is growing louder. This was the world into which Confucius would later be born. He did not appear in a peaceful age with stable institutions. He lived in a time when the authority of ancient ritual was fading, when noble families competed within states, when rulers often ignored moral advice, and when thoughtful people could feel that something precious had been lost. His longing for order was not abstract. It came from watching a world where inherited forms remained visible but no longer had the strength to guide human behavior. The same unrest would also give rise to other thinkers. Some would seek order through virtue, others through natural simplicity, others through universal care-law strategy or disciplined administration. The spring and autumn period prepared the ground for all of them because it exposed the central problem. How can human beings live together when old bonds weaken and ambition grows stronger? The period also saw technological and economic changes. Iron began to appear more widely toward the later part of the era, though bronze remained important. Better tools helped agriculture expand. More productive farming supported larger populations. Larger populations strengthened states, but also increased the pressure on land and resources. Markets grew, cities expanded. The old world of small ritual aristocracies slowly shifted toward more complex political societies. Change did not arrive evenly. Some regions remained traditional, others adapted quickly. Some ruling houses grew weak while their ministers gained power. In some states, aristocratic clans struggled against one another so fiercely that the ruler himself became only one player among many. The weakening that had happened to the Zhou king began to repeat on smaller scales inside the states. Power kept moving downward and outward, from king to lords, from lords to great families, from inherited nobility toward capable ministers and military men. This movement was unsettling, but it also opened space. In an earlier, more rigid order, a man outside the highest hereditary ranks might have little chance to shape history. In the spring and autumn world, talent could travel, advice could be offered. A persuasive thinker, a disciplined administrator, or a brilliant general might find a ruler willing to listen. The age was dangerous but intellectually awake. It is easy to remember the spring and autumn period only as a prelude to the harsher warring states era. But it deserves to be seen on its own terms. It was a long season of transition where the old Zhou world was not yet gone and the future empire had not yet appeared. The age stood between memory and transformation. At dusk in this period, one might imagine a small state near the Central Plains. The fields outside the walls are quiet after harvest. Inside the court, nobles discuss an alliance with a stronger neighbor. A messenger has arrived from another state. In an ancestral hall, bronze vessels are arranged for ceremony, their inscriptions recalling older promises of loyalty and order. Beyond the city, farmers prepare for winter, not knowing whether the coming year will bring peace tribute or the sound of chariots moving across the road. This is the feeling of spring and autumn. The world still remembers harmony, but it can no longer rest inside it. Over time, the competition among states would grow sharper. The rituals that once softened warfare would lose much of their force. Armies would become larger. Infantry would matter more. Iron weapons and crossbows would change the battlefield. Governments would become more centralized and demanding. Smaller states would disappear until only a few great powers remained. But before that harsher age arrives, the spring and autumn period gives us something essential, the moment when ancient China began asking its most important moral and political questions. It asked them not in calm, but in unease. The Zhou king still sat in Luoyang with a sacred title. The Lord still spoke of loyalty. The rituals still continued. Yet everyone who watched carefully could sense that the old pattern was loosening. The seasons still turned, but the human world beneath them was changing. And from that changing world, voices would soon rise. A teacher from Lu would speak of virtue ritual and humane conduct. Other thinkers would speak of the way of law of universal care, of strategy of order. Their ideas would not come from silence. They would come from roads between rival states, from courts that needed advice, from villages tired of war, and from the feeling that the world had lost its proper balance. The spring and autumn period began with the weakening of a king. It would end by preparing the minds of those who tried to understand what true order should be. Confucius, Laozi, and the search for order. In a world where old rituals were still remembered but no longer fully obeyed, thoughtful people began to ask what had gone wrong. The Zhou king remained in Luoyang with his sacred title, but his power had become thin. The feudal lords still spoke the language of loyalty, yet many of them cared more about territory alliances and military advantage. Inside the states, noble families competed with one another. Ministers rose and fell. Smaller states disappeared into stronger ones. Farmers worked beneath the weight of taxes and service, while rulers looked for ways to survive in a world that seemed to grow less certain with every generation. It was in this unsettled age that some of China's most enduring ideas began to take shape. Philosophy in ancient China did not grow from calm isolation. It grew from disorder. It came from roads between rival states, from courts in need of advice, from old songs remembered in a world that no longer matched them, and from the quiet anxiety of people who felt that the proper pattern of life had been disturbed. A thinker in this period did not ask questions only to satisfy curiosity. He asked because the world needed repair. How should a ruler behave when power tempts him towards selfishness? How should families hold together when public life is unstable? What gives a human being dignity? Can ritual still matter if people perform it without sincerity? Should society be guided by moral example, by natural simplicity, by universal care, or by strict law? These questions were not abstract. They belonged to a time when every answer might shape policy, survival, or war. The most famous voice to emerge from this world was Confucius, known in Chinese as Kongzi. He was born in 551 BCE in the state of Lu, a relatively small state that preserved many old Zhou traditions. Lu was not the greatest military power of the age, but it carried the memory of ritual culture with special care. This mattered deeply for Confucius. He grew up in a world where the forms of ancient order were still visible: ancestral ceremonies, music, proper conduct, respect for elders, and the language of duty. But he also saw that these forms were weakening. For Confucius, the crisis of his age was moral before it was political. States were not only fighting because they lacked strategy. Families were not only troubled because they lacked rules. Rulers were not only failing because their armies were weak. Beneath all of that, he believed people had forgotten how to cultivate virtue. They had forgotten how to behave with sincerity, restraint, and humanity. They still had rituals, but rituals without inner goodness could become empty gestures. Confucius looked back to the early Zhou not because he wanted to freeze time, but because he saw in that remembered age a model of moral harmony. He believed that society began with relationships: a child and parent, younger and elder subject, and ruler, friend and friend, husband and wife. Each relationship carried responsibilities. If people fulfilled those responsibilities with sincerity, the family would become ordered. If families were ordered, the state would become more stable. If rulers governed by virtue, the people would be guided not only by fear, but by respect. One of his most important ideas was Ren often translated as humanist benevolence, or deep human-heartedness. Ren was not merely kindness in a simple sense. It was the cultivated ability to treat others with moral concern. A person with Ren did not act only for himself. He understood that human life was relational, that one's conduct shaped the lives of others. For Confucius, a truly noble person was not noble because of birth alone. He was noble because of character. This ideal person was called the Junzi. Originally, the word referred to a gentleman or nobleman, but Confucius gave it a moral meaning. A Junzi was a person who cultivated virtue, practiced self-restraint, honored ritual, spoke carefully, learned constantly, and acted with integrity. He did not chase profit first. He did not use power carelessly. He tried to become worthy of trust. This was a quiet revolution. In an aristocratic world, status came from lineage. Confucius did not erase the importance of social roles, but he shifted attention toward moral cultivation. A man born into rank could still be petty. A man of lower background could become noble in conduct if he studied, reflected, and lived rightly. This gave education a new importance. Confucius loved learning. For him, learning was not simply memorizing old texts. It was a way of shaping the self. To study the songs, rituals, history, and examples of the past was to train the heart and mind. The past was not dead material. It was a guide, a mirror, and sometimes a warning. Through learning, a person could become more disciplined, more humane, and more able to serve others. Ritual or li was another central part of his thought. To modern ears, ritual can sound stiff or formal, but for Confucius, li was the visible shape of respect. It taught people how to mourn properly, how to honor parents, how to serve rulers, how to receive guests, how to speak with restraint, and how to behave in ways that made social life gentle rather than chaotic. Ritual trained emotion. It turned grief into mourning gratitude, into offering authority, into responsibility, and family affection into lasting duty. But Confucius did not value ritual as empty performance. If a person bowed without respect, the gesture was hollow. If a son performed ancestral rites but did not truly honor his parents, the ceremony lost its heart. The outer form and inner sincerity had to meet. This is why Confucius's teaching feels so different from mere rule following. He wanted people to become inwardly worthy of the forms they practiced. His political ideal followed the same pattern. A ruler should lead through virtue. If he governed well, the people would be drawn toward order as grass bends beneath the wind. Harsh punishments might control behavior for a time, but they could not make people good. Moral, example, proper ritual, wise ministers, and care for the people were more lasting. A ruler who cultivated himself could help cultivate the state. In reality, Confucius struggled to find rulers who would truly listen. He served in government for a time, but much of his life was spent traveling, teaching, and hoping to find a Lord willing to apply his principles. He moved from state to state with disciples offering advice. in an age that often preferred quick advantage over moral reform. There is something quietly moving in this image, an aging teacher walking through a fractured world carrying old songs, old rites, and a stubborn belief that human beings could still be made better. His disciples remembered his conversations, sayings, and responses. These were later gathered into the Analects, a text that would become one of the most influential works in Chinese history. Confucius did not become dominant in his own lifetime. He was not the founder of a dynasty. He did not command armies. Yet, after his death, his ideas slowly gained power because they offered something Chinese rulers and families would continue to need: a language of order, rooted in morality, education, and relationship. But Confucius was not the only voice of the age. Another tradition, very different in tone, came to be associated with Laozi and the Tao. The historical Laozi is more difficult to grasp than Confucius. Stories describe him as an older contemporary of Confucius, perhaps a keeper of archives, perhaps a sage who left the world behind. The text attributed to him, the Tao Te Ching, is brief, poetic, mysterious, and deeply influential. Whether it was written by one person or shaped over time by many voices, it became the foundation of Taoist thought. Where Confucius looked toward rituals, social roles, and moral cultivation, Taoist thought turned toward the natural pattern beneath human striving. The central idea is the Tao, often translated as the way. The Tao is not easy to define, and in some sense, Taoist writing warns us that the deepest reality cannot be captured fully by words. It is the underlying course of things, the quiet pattern through which nature moves. Water flows downward. Trees grow without command. Seasons turn without argument. The Tao is not forced, yet nothing stands outside it. To live well in this view is not to impose too much. It is to become simple, humble, receptive, and aligned with the natural movement of life. Taoist thought often values softness over hardness, stillness over aggression, emptiness over excess. Water becomes a favorite image because it is yielding and powerful at the same time. It does not fight the stone directly, yet over time it wears the stone away. It takes the low place, and because of that, it endures. In politics, this suggested a very different kind of rulership from the ambitions of the age. A Taoist ruler should not burden the people with endless commands, projects, punishments, and desires. He should govern lightly. He should reduce interference. He should avoid glory conquest and restless control. The more rulers tried to force the world into shape, the more disorder they might create. Sometimes the best action was not aggressive action, but wise restraint. This idea is often called Wu Wei, or non-forcing. Wu Wei does not mean doing nothing in a lazy sense. It means acting in harmony with the nature of things without unnecessary struggle. A skilled person can work so naturally that the action seems effortless. A good ruler can create conditions in which people live simply and peacefully without feeling the heavy hand of government at every moment. For listeners drifting toward sleep, Taoist thought has a special softness. It asks us to imagine a world where not everything must be tightened, named controlled, or conquered. It reminds us that stillness can be a form of wisdom. It speaks gently against the noise of ambition. In a time of war and competition, such a message must have felt almost like a quiet stream heard far from the road. Yet Taoism was not simply an escape from society. It was also a critique of the age. When states grew more aggressive, when rulers sought power, when rituals became empty, and when people exhausted themselves chasing rank and wealth, Taoist thought suggested that the problem might be too much striving. Human beings had moved too far from simplicity. They had forgotten how to live with the grain of the world. Alongside Confucianism and Taoism, other schools also appeared. One of them was Mohism, associated with Mozi. Mozi lived after Confucius and offered a sharp critique of many Confucian practices. He argued for universal care or impartial concern, saying that people should care for others beyond narrow family and clan bonds. He opposed costly rituals, elaborate funerals, and aggressive warfare, believing that such things wasted resources and harmed the common people. Mozi's world was practical and ethical. He wanted rulers to benefit the people. He valued merit over aristocratic birth. He believed that officials should be chosen for ability, not lineage. He criticized music and luxury when they consumed labor that could have fed or protected the poor. In a time when states poured resources into war, and display Mohism spoke with the urgency of someone looking at human suffering and asking what actually helps. Mohist followers were known for discipline and organization. Some became experts in defensive warfare, helping cities resist attack. This may seem surprising for a school that criticized aggression, but it fits their view. They opposed offensive war, yet believed communities should be protected from violence. In this way, Mohism combined moral idealism with technical practicality. Then there were the early legalist tendencies, which would later become especially powerful in the warring states and the Qin. Legalist thinkers began from a more severe view of human behavior. They did not trust moral example alone. They did not believe that ritual or kindness could reliably restrain ambition. To create order, they argued the state needed clear laws, strict rewards, harsh punishments, and strong institutions. People would behave properly not because they were inwardly transformed, but because the system made obedience rational and disobedience costly. This was not a gentle philosophy, but rulers found it useful. In an age of competition, a state that relied only on noble virtue might be defeated by a state with stronger administration-disciplined soldiers and clear laws. Legalist ideas answered the needs of rulers who wanted results. They were less interested in the moral beauty of the past than in the practical mechanics of power. The contrast among these schools is one of the great achievements of ancient Chinese thought. Confucians sought order through virtue, ritual, family, and education. Taoists sought harmony through simplicity, naturalness, and non-forcing. Mohists sought benefit through universal care, merit, and opposition to wasteful aggression. Legalists sought stability through law, discipline, and centralized control. They disagreed deeply, but they were all responding to the same wounded world. The old Zhou order had loosened. Warfare was increasing. Rulers needed advice. The people needed relief. The question was not whether order was necessary. Everyone could feel that it was. The question was what kind of order could truly last. A court in this age might receive many kinds of visitors. One advisor might urge the ruler to restore proper rights and govern by moral example. Another might warn that too much ceremony wastes the labor of the people. Another might speak of the Tao and recommend fewer laws, fewer desires, and less interference. Still another might insist that only strict institutions could make the state strong enough to survive. The ruler listened not always because he loved wisdom, but because wisdom could become strategy. This gave thinkers a role in politics unlike anything earlier. Ideas were no longer only inherited traditions. They became tools, arguments, proposals, and programs. Men traveled with their teachings hoping to find patrons. Some failed. Some were ignored. Some influenced ministers and rulers. Some would become powerful only after their deaths. But together, they created what later scholars called the 100 Schools of Thought. The phrase does not mean exactly 100 schools. It suggests abundance. Many voices, many paths, many attempts to answer disorder. For the people living through the time, this intellectual flowering may not have felt grand. A farmer burdened by taxes might not care whether a minister quoted Confucius or followed stricter laws. A soldier marching toward a frontier might not feel comforted by arguments about the Tao. A mother worried about grain might not know the names of philosophers traveling between courts. Yet the ideas being formed above and around them would eventually shape the institutions, ethics, and language of Chinese civilization. Philosophy often begins far from the people it later affects. A saying remembered by a disciple can become a principle taught to officials. A warning against harsh rule can become advice to emperors. A reflection on water and softness can become a spiritual path. A legal reform can change the lives of entire villages. This is why the age of thinkers matters so deeply. It did not stop war immediately. It did not restore the Zhou king's power. It did not save every small state from conquest, but it gave China a set of intellectual tools that would endure long after the states that first debated them had disappeared. As the spring and autumn period moved toward its end, the world grew more intense. The old ritual forms remained, but they were increasingly overshadowed by the needs of survival. Warfare became larger and less restrained. States became more centralized. Rulers demanded more from their populations. The competition that had once been moderated by aristocratic codes began to harden into something more ruthless. The thinkers had asked how order might be restored. The next age would test those answers in a harsher fire. Before we leave this part of the story, imagine Confucius near the end of his life, perhaps disappointed that no ruler had fully embraced his way. He had traveled, taught, advised, and preserved what he believed was precious. The world around him had not healed, yet his students listened. They remembered his words. They carried them forward. At the same time, somewhere in the broader landscape of thought, the voice of the Tao spoke in a different rhythm, reminding people that the deepest way cannot be forced. Mohist teachers argued for practical care and the reduction of suffering. Legalist minds sharpened their ideas for states that wanted strength more than gentleness. All of them belonged to the same long dusk of Zhou order. The old world was fading, but it did not fade into silence. It faded into argument, teaching memory and restless thought. And from that thought, later, China would draw again and again whenever rulers sought legitimacy, families sought guidance, scholars sought purpose, or weary people looked for a way to live through disorder. The spring and autumn period had opened the question. The warring states period would make it urgent. The warring states and the furnace of power. By the time the spring and autumn period faded, the old world of ritual warfare had grown thin. The Zhou king still remained, but only as a distant symbol. The title, Son of Heaven, had not disappeared, and the memory of the mandate of heaven still hovered over the political world. Yet the real decisions of the age were no longer made in the Zhou royal court. They were made in the halls of ambitious states where rulers studied maps, counted grain, appointed ministers, trained armies, and watched their neighbors with suspicion. The age that followed was harsher. Later, historians called it the Warring States period. It lasted from the 5th century BCE to 221 BCE, and in those centuries, the many states of the Zhou world were slowly reduced to a smaller number of great powers. The old landscape of dozens upon dozens of rival houses gave way to 7 major states: Qin Shi Huang, Yanhanzhao, and Wei. Each of them wanted survival. Each of them also wanted more. The word warring can make the period sound like nothing but endless battle, but it was more complex than that. It was an age of violence, certainly, but also of reform strategy, administration, engineering, agriculture, philosophy, diplomacy, and technical innovation. It was a time when states learned to become stronger by becoming more organized. The pressure of war forced them to count more carefully, govern more directly, and use human labor with a new intensity. The rituals of the old aristocratic world did not vanish overnight, but they lost much of their power. In earlier times, noble warriors and chariots had dominated the battlefield, and war could still be framed through honor, rank, and ceremony. By the Warring States period, the scale had changed. Armies grew much larger. Infantry became more important. Peasant soldiers were conscripted in great numbers. Iron weapons spread. Crossbows gave foot soldiers a deadly reach. Cavalry became more useful, especially as northern and western influences reshaped military practice. War was no longer only the affair of nobles. It reached deep into the villages. A farmer might spend one season in the field and another under arms. His labor fed the state, and his body could be called to defend or expand it. Families watched sons leave for campaigns whose causes were decided far away. In some years, fields lacked strong hands because the state needed soldiers. In other years, taxes rose because walls, weapons, canals, and granaries had to be built. For ordinary people, the Warring States period may not have felt like a grand struggle for all under heaven. It may have felt like more demands, longer roads, stricter officials, and the uneasy knowledge that the boundary of one state could change after a defeat. And yet, the same pressure that burdened the people also made the states more capable. Rulers learned that old feudal privilege could weaken them. A nobleman with inherited land and private loyalty might not serve the state efficiently. Powerful families could resist central authority. Regional aristocrats could place their own interests above the ruler's plans. So across the Warring States world, many states began to build stronger administrations. Land was divided into counties and districts. Officials were appointed directly by the ruler. Taxes were collected more systematically. Population registers became important. Laws were written more clearly. Military service was organized more broadly. Rewards and punishments were used to bind people to the state. This was one of the great transformations of the age. The old Joe world had been held together by kinship ritual and inherited rank. The Warring States world increasingly depended on bureaucracy, law, and measurable service. A ruler did not only need loyal relatives, he needed capable administrators. He needed men who could count grain, manage labor, maintain roads, organize soldiers, supervise irrigation, and report accurately. In this way, the state became colder, but also stronger. Power moved from personal bonds toward institutions. This change gave room to men of talent: advisors, strategists, reformers, diplomats, military theorists, and legal specialists traveled between courts. They offered plans for survival and expansion. Some were ignored. Others transformed entire states. In a world where defeat could mean extinction, rulers were willing to listen to ideas that earlier ages might have considered too harsh or too new. The intellectual life that had begun in the spring and autumn period did not stop. It sharpened. Confucians continued to argue that rulers needed virtue education and moral example. Taoist voices continued to remind people of simplicity, restraint, and the danger of excessive ambition. Mohists spoke of merit, universal care, practical benefit, and opposition to aggressive war. But the age increasingly gave attention to another kind of thought: legalism. Legalist thinkers did not begin with trust in human goodness. They believed that order required clear laws, strict enforcement, strong central authority, and a system of rewards and punishments that made people serve the state whether or not they were inwardly virtuous. To a Confucian, this could seem hard and shallow. To a ruler facing powerful enemies, it could seem useful. Legalism asked not how to make people noble, but how to make the state effective. This was its attraction. In an age of war, a ruler might admire virtue, but he also needed soldiers who obeyed farmers, who produced officials who reported honestly, and nobles who could not challenge him. Legalist reformers offered tools for that world. They reduced the power of hereditary privilege. They rewarded military achievement. They punished disorder. They placed agriculture and warfare at the center of state strength. No state would use these ideas more effectively than Qin. But before Qin becomes the focus of our story, we should understand the wider field in which it rose. The 7 major states each had its own geography, culture, strengths, and weaknesses. Qi lay in the east near the coast. It was wealthy, connected to trade, salt fishing, and intellectual life. Its rulers sponsored scholars, and its capital became associated with debate and learning. Qi could be refined and practical at the same time, looking outward toward both land and sea. Chu dominated much of the south. It was vast, rich, and culturally distinct. To some central states, Chu seemed less properly Zhou, more southern, more colorful, more connected to river valleys, forests, and older local traditions. But Chu was no minor outsider. It was one of the great powers of the age, with deep resources and a broad territory that could sustain immense ambition. Yan stood in the north, more remote and shaped by contact with frontier peoples. Its position made it different from the central states. It looked toward colder lands and steppe influences where horses border defense and exchange with non-Zhou peoples mattered. Hanzhou and Wei occupied the central plains. They had emerged from the partition of the old state of Qin, and their position placed them near the heart of interstate conflict. They were strategically important, but also exposed. Each had to maneuver carefully among stronger neighbors. And then there was Qin in the west. For much of earlier history, Qin had been viewed by some eastern states as rough, frontier-like, less polished than the old centers of Zhou culture. Its homeland, in the Wei River Valley, was protected by mountains and passes, giving it a defensible base. It also faced frontier conflict, which hardened its military culture. Over time, these features became strengths. Qin had room to reform. Its aristocracy was less deeply entrenched than in some older states. Its rulers were willing to accept harsh changes. Its geography allowed it to build power, while limiting the danger of sudden invasion from all sides. And when the right reforms came, Qin would become something the other states feared: disciplined, efficient, and relentless. One of the most important reformers in Qin was Shang Yang. In the 4th century BCE, Shang Yang helped transform Qin through a series of legalist reforms. He weakened hereditary nobility, organized the population into mutual responsibility groups, rewarded soldiers for battlefield merit, encouraged agriculture, standardized administration, and placed service to the state above old family privilege. His laws were severe, and later stories remember him as a harsh figure. But the results were powerful. Qin became stronger. Farmers were pushed to produce more grain. Soldiers were pushed to fight harder. Officials were tied more directly to the ruler. The old aristocratic softness that legalists feared was cut away. The state became like a sharpened tool. Such reforms came at a cost. For the common people, order often meant pressure. A family could be held responsible for the wrongdoing of one member. Military service could bring reward, but also death far from home. Agriculture was honored, but also demanded. The state did not ask whether people felt inspired. It measured what they produced, how they obeyed, and what they contributed. This was the darker side of state building. The same institutions that made Qin powerful could make life heavy for those beneath them. Yet, in the logic of the warring states, harshness could seem like survival. A gentle state that failed to organize might be conquered. A strict state that produced grain and soldiers could endure. War also drove technology. Iron tools helped farmers clear land and improve yields. Better plows, irrigation systems, and water management expanded agricultural production. Canals allowed grain and troops to move more efficiently. Roads connected administrative centers. Walls protected borders. Standard measures and records made taxation and supply more manageable. The battlefield was only one part of the struggle. Behind every army stood fields, workshops, storehouses, scribes, engineers, and laborers. Victory depended not only on courage, but on logistics. A ruler had to know how many men he could feed, how far grain could travel, how quickly troops could move, and whether a campaign would exhaust the state before it defeated the enemy. This practical thinking gave the age a hard clarity. It also gave rise to strategic writing. The art of war traditionally associated with Sun Tzu belongs to this broad world of conflict and calculation. Its exact date and authorship are debated, but its ideas reflect the realities of an age in which war had become a matter of intelligence, deception, flexibility, and careful planning. It teaches that the best victory is not always the bloodiest one. To break an enemy's plans, divide alliances, move with speed, and understand conditions may matter more than brute strength. Such ideas fit the warring states world perfectly. A ruler could lose everything through one mistake. A general could destroy an army by misreading terrain, supply, morale, or timing. Alliances shifted constantly. Diplomats traveled between courts, persuading rulers to join vertical or horizontal alliances, to resist Qin, to cooperate with Qin, to betray one another, or to wait. The age of the wandering persuader had arrived. These men carried words like weapons. They understood fear, pride, ambition, and timing. One advisor might convince a small state to join a coalition for protection. Another might persuade a stronger state to attack before its rivals could unite. Diplomacy became a battlefield of its own, fought in audience halls rather than valleys. For listeners, it is worth slowing down here. The Warring States period was not only a noisy age of armies, it was an age of anxious rooms, quiet calculations, and maps studied late into the night. A ruler might sit with ministers listening as they described the strengths of Chu, the wealth of Qi, the exposed position of Han, the danger of Zhao, or the growing power of Qin. Outside the palace, lamps burned in administrative offices where scribes copied records and officials counted households. Far away, farmers slept lightly, knowing that the state's needs would return with the morning. The weight of history was becoming more organized. Earlier rulers had depended on ritual prestige and personal loyalty. Warring states rulers depended on systems. This made their states more powerful than anything before, but also more demanding. Human life was increasingly measured, registered, taxed, conscripted, and directed. Still, culture did not vanish beneath administration. Poetry, music, ritual, and philosophy continued. Chu especially contributed richly to the poetic imagination of ancient China. Its southern landscapes, river spirits, shamanic tones, and emotional intensity would leave a mark on later literature. Qi's intellectual centers drew scholars into debate. Even as states prepared for war, they also patronized thinkers, argued over governance, and preserved texts. The age was brutal, but brilliant. This is often true of periods of crisis. When old structures break, fear increases, but so does experimentation. The Warring States period forced China to imagine new forms of power. It created stronger governments, larger armies, deeper administrative reach, and sharper political theories. It also made the dream of unification more urgent. At first, all 7 states wanted advantage. Over time, the logic of competition narrowed. Smaller states disappeared. Great powers weakened one another. Alliances formed against Qin, then failed. Some rulers hesitated when they needed to act. Others acted too quickly. Ministers were bribed. Generals were recalled. Strategies succeeded for a season and failed in the next. The map moved toward a conclusion. By the 3rd century BCE, Qin had become the most dangerous state. Its reforms had made it disciplined. Its location protected its core. Its armies had grown formidable. Its rulers understood the machinery of power better than most of their rivals. The other states feared Qin, but fear did not always produce unity. Suspicion among rivals made lasting cooperation difficult. This was one of Qin's great advantages. The eastern states knew Qin was rising, but they could not always trust one another enough to stop it. Each hoped to survive. Each feared being betrayed. Each tried to calculate whether resistance, alliance, delay, or compromise would bring safety. Meanwhile, Qin continued to expand. The old Zhou king still existed for much of this period, but his role was nearly empty. The mandate of heaven had become a prize no one fully held. The idea of all under heaven remained powerful, but there was no true son of heaven with the strength to embody it. The warring states fought beneath a broken symbol of unity, and the very violence of the age made people imagine the possibility of a single ruler who could end the chaos. Unification, once only an ideal of ritual order, began to look like a political necessity. But what kind of unification would it be? A Confucian might hope for a humane ruler, one who restored moral order and cared for the people. A Taoist might fear that too much centralized control would only deepen suffering. A Mohist might ask whether unification would reduce war or simply concentrate power. A legalist would see the opportunity clearly: one ruler, one law, one administration, one state strong enough to silence rivals. The state that finally unified China would not do so gently. It would be Qin. As the Warring States period moved toward its end, the air of the age grew heavy with inevitability. The tools of empire were already present: bureaucracy, law, taxation, mass armies, roads, registers, and standardized authority. What had not yet appeared was the person who would bring them together under one throne. That person would be born as Ying Jing, King of Qin. Later, he would take a title no ruler before him had used in quite the same way. He would call himself the first emperor. But before he could claim all under heaven, Qin had to finish what centuries of competition had prepared. The Warring States period was a furnace. Into it went old Zhou ritual, noble warfare, village, labor, philosophical debate, frontier, hardship, legal reform, iron tools, diplomatic cunning, and the ambition of 7 rival powers. Out of it would come something harder, colder, and more unified than ancient China had ever known before. The age of many states was nearing its end. The age of empire was waiting just beyond the passes of Qin. Qin rises from the western frontier. In the far west of the old Zhou world, beyond the older centers of ritual culture and courtly refinement, Qin had been growing for a long time. To some of the eastern states, Qin seemed rough. It stood near the frontier, closer to mountains, passes, and peoples beyond the familiar heartland. Its customs were sometimes viewed with suspicion by states that considered themselves more polished, more connected to the ancient Zhou tradition, and more proper in ritual. But history does not always move through the places that appear most elegant. Sometimes it gathers strength in harder lands where survival demands discipline before beauty. Qin's homeland lay in the Wei River Valley, a region protected by mountains and strategic passes. This geography mattered. The land could be fertile enough to support agriculture, while the surrounding terrain made invasion more difficult. Qin could look eastward toward the Central Plains, but it was not as exposed as states trapped among many powerful neighbors. It had room to build strength behind natural barriers. The frontier also shaped its people. For generations, Qin faced pressure from groups beyond the Zhou cultural world. Contact with these neighboring peoples could mean trade conflict, adaptation, and constant military readiness. A state that lived on the edge could not rely only on ceremony. It needed horses, weapons, fortified positions, practical leaders, and a population accustomed to hardship. Over time, the things that made Qin seem less refined to others helped make it more prepared for the brutal logic of the warring states. Still, geography alone did not make Qin dominant. Many states had advantages. Chu had vast territory, Qi had wealth and access to trade, Zhao had strong cavalry traditions. Wei had once been a leader in reform. Han held strategic ground. Yan guarded the north. Qin became different because it transformed itself more completely than the others. The central figure in this transformation was Shang Yang. He arrived in Qin during the 4th century BCE and found a ruler willing to listen to difficult advice. Shang Yang belonged to the world of legalist reformers, men who believed that a state could survive only if power was centralized, laws were clear rewards, where certain punishments were severe, and old aristocratic privilege was cut away. His ideas were not gentle, but Qin did not need gentleness. It needed strength. Under Shang Yang's reforms, Qin changed from a frontier state into a disciplined machine of agriculture and war. The old nobility lost much of its automatic privilege. Rank was no longer supposed to rest only on birth. Military achievement became a path to honor. A soldier who performed well in battle could rise. A noble who did nothing useful could lose influence. This was a dramatic shift in a world where lineage had long shaped status. Qin began to tell its people, in effect, that service to the state mattered more than inherited name. Agriculture was also placed at the center of policy. Farmers were encouraged, pressured, and rewarded for production. The state needed grain because grain fed soldiers, workers, horses, officials, and cities. A strong harvest was not only a private blessing for a family, it was a military resource. Fields and battlefields became connected. The hand that planted millet was helping support the army, whether the farmer wished to think of it that way or not. Households were registered, communities were organized into units of mutual responsibility. People were expected to report wrongdoing. If one person broke the law and others failed to report it, the punishment could reach beyond the individual. This created fear, but it also extended the state's eyes into village life. Qin did not depend only on the honor of nobles or the memory of ritual. It built systems that watched, counted, rewarded, and punished. For ordinary families, these reforms could feel heavy. A farmer in Qin might work with a sharper sense that the state was near. His field, his harvest, his household, his sons, and his obligations were all tied to official demands. Good production could bring reward. Failure, disorder, or disobedience could bring punishment. A young man might see military service as danger, but also as one of the few ways to rise in rank. The law pressed down on people, but it also gave some a path that birth alone might once have blocked. This is one reason Qin became powerful. It made the population useful to the state in a direct and organized way. Other states also reformed, but Qin's reforms were especially deep and lasting. The ruler's authority grew stronger. Local administration became more efficient. Land and labor were managed more systematically. The army became disciplined. The rewards for military success encouraged aggressive campaigns. Over time, Qin society was shaped around the needs of conquest. Yet, Shang Yang's own end revealed the danger of the system he helped build. After the ruler who supported him died, enemies at court moved against him. He was executed, and later stories describe his death as brutal, but his reforms survived him. This is one of the strange patterns of history. A man can be destroyed by politics, while the institutions he created continue to shape the world. Qin kept becoming stronger. As the Warring States period continued, Qin expanded eastward. Its armies moved through mountain passes into the Central Plains. Its generals were disciplined, its administration supplied campaigns effectively, and its rulers learned how to use both war and diplomacy. Qin could attack one state while negotiating with another. It could exploit rivalries among its enemies. It could wait when waiting was useful and strike when the balance favored it. The eastern states feared Qin, but fear did not make them united. This was one of the great weaknesses of Qin's rivals. They knew Qin was dangerous, but each state also feared the others. A coalition against Qin might form for a time, then weaken through suspicion, bribery, strategic disagreement, or the hope that someone else would bear the greatest cost. Qin benefited from this lack of trust. Its enemies faced not only Qin's armies, but their own inability to act together for long. Meanwhile, the Zhou royal house had become almost irrelevant. For centuries, the Zhou king had remained as a symbolic center, preserving the memory of the mandate of heaven, even after practical power had passed to the states. But by the late Warring States period, that symbolic world was fading. The question was no longer whether the Zhou king could restore unity. He could not. The question was which of the competing states would claim the right to rule all under heaven. In 256 BCE, Qin finally ended the last remnants of Zhou royal authority. This did not yet mean that China was unified. The other states still remained, but symbolically, something ancient had passed away. The Zhou, whose mandate of heaven had once justified the overthrow of Shang, were gone as a ruling house. The old ritual center had disappeared. The path was open for a new kind of order, one not based on feudal grants and ancient ceremonies, but on direct rule, law, bureaucracy, and military power. Into this world came Yin Zheng. He became king of Qin in 246 BCE while still young. Like many rulers who came to power early, he first stood beneath the influence of ministers, advisors, and court factions. But as he matured, he proved to be a ruler of immense ambition and force. He inherited a state already sharpened by generations of reform, and he used it with extraordinary determination. Yin Zheng did not create Qin's strength from nothing. He received the machinery of a disciplined state. But he had the will to drive that machinery toward a single goal, the destruction of all rival states and the unification of the Chinese world. His court included capable ministers, among them Li Si, a legalist thinker and administrator, who would become one of the most important figures in the creation of imperial rule. Qin also relied on brilliant generals who could carry out large-scale campaigns with precision. By this stage, conquest was not a matter of heroic raids. It was a matter of planning, supply timing intelligence, and relentless pressure. Qin's wars of unification unfolded over a little more than a decade. The first of the 6 rival states to fall was Han. Han was the weakest of the great states and lay in a vulnerable position near Qin's eastern path. In 230 BCE, Qin absorbed it. This was more than a victory over one enemy. It was the beginning of the final sequence. Once one state had fallen, the balance of fear changed. The remaining states could see that Qin was no longer merely expanding, it was eliminating them. Zhao was next to face disaster. Zhao had once been one of Qin's strongest rivals, with a serious military tradition and experience in northern warfare. But years of conflict, internal weaknesses, and strategic pressure had left it vulnerable. In 228 BCE, Qin took the Zhao capital. The state's power was broken, though resistance continued in some forms for a time. Another great rival had fallen. Wei followed in 225 BCE. Qin's campaign against Wei is remembered for a striking use of water. Qin forces reportedly diverted a river to flood the Wei capital, forcing surrender. Whether we imagine the scene in exact detail or simply as a symbol, it shows something important about Qin warfare. Qin did not depend only on courage in battle. It used engineering, pressure, and the environment itself as instruments of conquest. Then came Chu, the great southern power. Chu was vast, wealthy, and difficult to conquer. It had deep resources and a strong cultural identity. Qin's first effort against Chu did not succeed as easily as expected, reminding us that even a powerful state could misjudge the scale of resistance. But Qin returned with greater force under experienced command. In 223 BCE, Chu was defeated. This was one of the decisive moments of the unification. With Chu gone, the old balance among the great states was effectively shattered. Yan in the north fell in 222 BCE. Yan had tried desperate measures, including the famous story of an attempted assassination of Yingzheng by Jing Ke. This tale, preserved in later tradition, became one of the dramatic episodes of the age, a ruler who seemed unstoppable, and a state so threatened that it turned to a single blade and a dangerous plan. The attempt failed. Qin continued. Yan could not withstand the larger force moving against it. Finally, Qi surrendered in 221 BCE. Qi was wealthy and cultured, but by the time Qin turned fully toward it, the other states were gone. Isolated and unable to resist effectively, Qi gave way with little struggle, compared with the terrible wars that had consumed others. The last rival had fallen. For the first time, the lands of the old Zhou world were brought under one ruler. This was a moment unlike anything before it. Earlier, kings had claimed broad authority. The Zhou king had been son of heaven. Powerful hegemons had led alliances. Great states had dominated regions. But no one before Yingzheng had truly eliminated all major rivals and created a single centralized state across the Chinese world. The long age of competing kingdoms ended, and something new took its place. Qin Shi took a new title to mark the change. He became Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin. The title itself mattered. He did not call himself merely king. The old title of king belonged to the age of many states. He needed a name that stood above all earlier rulers. Huang Di combined ancient and exalted meanings, evoking legendary sovereigns and divine-like authority. By calling himself the first emperor, he announced not only that he had conquered the present, but that he intended to begin an endless line of imperial successors. He imagined history starting again from himself. The unification of Qin ended the warring states period, but it did not bring immediate softness. The same methods that had made Qin victorious would now be applied to the conquered world. Direct administration, strict law, standardized systems, and centralized command would replace the old feudal pattern. The emperor did not want a loose realm of semi-independent lords. He wanted one state, one authority, one order. For some people, unification may have brought relief. After centuries of war, the end of rival states could mean safer roads, fewer shifting borders, and the possibility that large-scale conflict might finally stop. Merchants could imagine wider exchange. Officials could imagine uniform systems. Farmers might hope that armies would no longer march so often between competing rulers. But unification also brought fear. Qin had not conquered through gentleness, and it would not govern gently. Its laws were strict, its demands were heavy, its projects would require enormous labor. To turn many states into one empire, Qin would need to break old identities, standardize practices, suppress dissent, and make the emperor's will reach places that had long followed their own traditions. The victory was complete, but the work of empire had only begun. This is why Qin's rise feels both impressive and unsettling. It ended centuries of division, but it did so with the tools of discipline and force. It created the first unified Chinese empire, yet its foundations were sharp. The question that had haunted the late Zhou world now took a new form. Order had returned, but what kind of order would it be? In the old stories, Yu the Great had controlled the floods by guiding the water-opening channels so life could continue. Qin Shi Huang also sought to control a world that had overflowed its old boundaries. But his way was not gentle guidance, it was command. Where the warring states had been many streams rushing against one another, Qin tried to force them into a single channel. For a moment, it seemed possible. The rival courts were gone. The old royal houses were broken. The king of Qin had become emperor. Officials carried orders into newly conquered lands. Scribes prepared standard forms, roads laws, weights measures currency, and writing would soon be reshaped under imperial command. The dream of unity had become real. But reality is heavier than a dream. To conquer all under heaven was one task. To hold it without exhausting the people was another. As we leave this part of the story, imagine the western state of Qin no longer as a frontier power looking east through mountain passes, but as the master of a newly unified realm. The maps in its court have changed. The names of rival kingdoms have become administrative problems. What had once been borders are now lines to be erased, measured, and governed. At the center stands Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, a man who had inherited a hardened state and used it to end centuries of war. His achievement was enormous. His methods were severe. And in the next part of the story, we will see how he tried to turn conquest into permanence by standardizing the empire, building roads and walls, silencing opposition, and searching for a way to outlast even death itself. The first emperor and the shape of empire. After the last rival state surrendered, the long age of division came to an end. For centuries, the lands of the old Zhou world had been broken into competing kingdoms. Their rulers had formed alliances, betrayed one another, raised armies, built walls, trained officials, and searched for any advantage that might keep them alive. Generations had grown up knowing that borders could shift, that a neighboring state could become an enemy, and that the dream of unity belonged more to memory than to daily life. Then Qin changed everything. In 221 BCE, Yingzheng, king of Qin, stood above a world his ancestors had only hoped to dominate. Han Jiawei, Chu Yan, and Qi had all fallen. The old royal houses were defeated. The Zhou order was gone. The warring states had been drawn into one political body under the rule of a single man. But victory on the battlefield was only the beginning. To conquer many states was one achievement. To make them feel like one empire was something far more difficult. The lands Qin now ruled had different customs, local memories, noble families, laws, currencies, writing styles, measures, roads, and habits of government. People in former Qi or Chu or Zhao did not suddenly wake up feeling that their old identities had disappeared. The first emperor had defeated their rulers, but he still had to defeat the old divisions inside daily life. He understood this clearly. That is why Qin Shi Huang did not try to rule as a traditional king among regional lords. He rejected the older feudal pattern that had weakened the Zhou. He did not want to grant large hereditary territories to relatives and allies who might one day become powerful enough to challenge the throne. Instead, he divided the empire into commanderies and counties, governed by officials appointed by the central state. This was one of the defining choices of Qin rule. Power would flow from the emperor downward through bureaucracy, not outward through semi-independent noble houses. Officials could be promoted, transferred, punished, or removed. Their authority came from the center, not from ancient family rights over local land. In theory, this made the empire more controllable. The emperor did not have to depend on lords whose loyalty might fade over generations. He could rely on administrators whose careers depended on service to the state. It was a cold and efficient idea. It also changed the meaning of rule in China. The empire would not be held together mainly by kinship and ritual as the early Zhou realm had been. It would be held together by law record-keeping official hierarchy roads, measurements, taxation, military organization, and the written commands of the ruler. In this sense, Qin took many of the tools developed during the warring states and stretched them across all under heaven. The emperor also ordered sweeping standardization. Weights and measures were unified so that grain goods, taxes, and trade could be counted in the same way across the empire. Currency was standardized, allowing money to circulate more easily from one region to another. Even the width of cart axles was regulated so that vehicles could travel more smoothly along roads built to a common standard. These details may sound small beside the drama of conquest, but they were essential to empire. A state cannot govern what it cannot measure. It cannot tax efficiently if every region counts differently. It cannot move goods and troops easily if roads and vehicles do not align. It cannot make law feel uniform if local habits remain stronger than central commands. Qin's standardization was not merely administrative tidiness. It was the practical language of unity. Writing was also standardized. Before Qin unification, the states had used related but varied forms of script. A character might appear differently in one region than in another. For scholars and scribes, this reflected the long diversity of the Zhou world. For an empire that wanted direct control, it was a problem. Qin promoted a standard written form, allowing officials across the realm to read and transmit commands with greater consistency. This decision had a lasting effect far beyond the short life of Qin itself. Spoken languages and regional dialects could vary widely, but a shared written script helped hold the civilization together. The ability of writing to cross local speech differences became one of the great strengths of Chinese administration and culture. Qin did not invent writing, of course. The thread reached back to Shang oracle bones and Zhou bronze inscriptions. But Qin gave that thread a new imperial function. Words became instruments of central power. A command written in the standard script could travel from the capital to distant districts. A report could return from the provinces to the court. Laws, records, registers, and tax documents could be organized in a common administrative language. The empire became not only a territory, but a system of written control. Roads were another part of this system. Qin built and expanded roads that radiated from the capital Xianyang. These roads allowed officials, soldiers, messengers, and supplies to move across the newly unified realm. They connected distant regions to the center, making the emperor's authority more present than it had ever been before. A road is not only a path for travel. In an empire, it is a vein through which power moves. Imagine one of those roads in the early Qin Empire. It cuts across the land with unusual straightness. Workers have cleared, leveled, and prepared it under official order. A messenger rides along it, carrying instructions sealed by authority. Soldiers march in another season. Grain carts move slowly beneath the weight of tax shipments. Officials travel to take up posts in places where they may not know the local customs, but where they carry the name of Qin. For villagers living near such a road, the empire was no longer an idea far away. It passed in front of them. The same was true of canals and other infrastructure projects. Qin needed to move grain supply armies and connect regions. Waterways, roads, and transport routes helped bind the empire together. But such projects required enormous labor. People were drafted from their homes to dig, carry, build, and repair. For the state, this was organization. For the laborer, it was often exhaustion. This is one of the central tensions of Qin rule. The empire created order, but the order was heavy. After centuries of warfare, many people may have welcomed the possibility of peace. The end of interstate conflict meant that the old borders no longer divided the land into rival camps. Trade could expand. Officials could apply uniform laws. Roads could become safer. The dream of unity spoken about for generations had become real. But the Qin version of unity demanded obedience at a scale many people had never known. The laws were strict. Punishments were severe. Labor service was extensive. Families and communities could be held responsible for one another. The same methods that had made Qin powerful during the warring states now pressed down on the entire empire. What had worked for a disciplined frontier state did not always sit gently upon newly conquered peoples with their own memories, customs, and resentments. Qin Shi Huang trusted control. He had seen what fragmentation had done to the Zhou world. He had seen how hereditary lords could become independent, how rival states could tear the land apart, and how old traditions could be used against central authority. His answer was to remove competing centers of power. Former noble families were moved, watched, weakened, or absorbed. Weapons from conquered states were collected and melted down. Local walls that had once separated states could be destroyed while frontier defenses were strengthened. The empire was to have one center. That center was the emperor. Around him, the court worked through officials and ministers, among whom Li Si was especially important. Li Si, trained in legalist thought, helped shape Qin's policies of centralization and standardization. To him and those who thought like him, disorder came from divided authority, private teachings, old loyalties, and moral arguments that weakened the law. The state had to be clear, unified, and unquestioned. This attitude led to one of the most infamous episodes of Qin rule, the burning of books and persecution of scholars. According to later accounts, in 213 BCE, Qin authorities ordered the destruction of many texts that were not useful to the state or that preserved traditions capable of criticizing imperial rule. Works of history, poetry, and philosophy were especially dangerous if they encouraged people to compare the present with the past and judge the emperor by older standards. Technical works on agriculture, medicine, divination, and practical matters were reportedly spared. The purpose was not simply hatred of books. It was control of memory. A ruler who wants to begin history again from himself cannot easily tolerate texts that remind people of different ways to rule. The old states had their own histories. The philosophers had their own teachings. Confucian scholars could look back to the Zhou and speak of virtue ritual and moral restraint. Such ideas might encourage criticism of Qin's harsh rule. For a legalist empire, this was dangerous. Later tradition also tells of scholars being executed or buried alive for resisting or criticizing the regime. The exact details have been debated by historians, and some accounts may have been shaped by Han writers who wanted to portray Qin as a warning. But the memory of the event became powerful. It marked Qin Shi Huang as a ruler who feared the independence of thought and tried to make the empire obey not only in body, but in memory. For a bedtime telling, we do not need to make this scene loud. It is enough to imagine a scholar in a quiet room looking at bamboo slips that preserve songs, histories, and teachings from earlier generations. Outside, officials carry out the emperor's command. What is being threatened is not only paper or bamboo, but the fragile bridge between past and present. Some texts may be hidden. Some may be lost. Some may survive only because someone quietly refuses to let memory burn completely. Qin also turned its attention to the northern frontier. Long before Qin unification, several states had built walls to defend against raids from northern peoples. Qin Shi Huang ordered some of these earlier walls to be linked, repaired, and extended. This was not yet the Great Wall as most people imagine it today, with the grand brick and stone sections built in later dynasties. But it formed an early defensive system across parts of the northern frontier. The work required massive labor. Men were sent far from home to build and repair walls in harsh landscapes. The weather could be severe, supplies were difficult, many workers suffered, and many never returned. To the state, the walls represented security. To the families of laborers, they could represent absence grief and the cost of imperial ambition. The wall is therefore a complicated symbol. It shows Qin's desire to protect the realm from outside threats. It also shows the empire's willingness to consume human labor on an enormous scale. It draws a line across the land, but also across memory, between order and fear defense, and suffering achievement and burden. The first emperor's ambition did not stop with administration, roads, laws, or walls. He also wanted to master death. As he grew older, Qin Shi Huang became increasingly concerned with immortality. He sent expeditions in search of islands of the immortals and elixirs that might allow him to live forever. Alchemists, magicians, and court specialists promised possibilities that no army could conquer. The emperor, who had defeated 6 states, now faced an enemy no conquest could remove. Death was the one frontier he could not standardize. There is something deeply human in this, despite the scale of his power. A ruler who commanded millions still feared the same ending as every farmer, soldier, scholar, and prisoner beneath him. He could order roads through mountains, walls across frontiers, and laws across the empire, but his own body remained mortal. His fear of death helped produce one of the most extraordinary tomb complexes in world history. Near modern Xi'an, beneath the earth, thousands of life-size terracotta soldiers were buried to guard the emperor in the afterlife. Each figure was shaped with individual features, different faces, hairstyles, expressions, armor ranks, and postures. There were infantrymen, archers, officers, horses, and chariots. They formed a silent army of clay arranged as if waiting for command. The Terracotta Army is remarkable not only because it is large, but because it reflects Qin's imagination of power beyond death. The emperor had unified the living world, and his tomb suggests that he wished to carry order into the unseen one. Just as he had organized soldiers, roads, officials, and laws in life, he surrounded himself with an organized army for the afterlife. The same desire for control passed beneath the soil. Yet the soldiers, are made of clay. That fact gives them a strange softness. They are not living men, though they represent men. They do not breathe, complain, march, or suffer. The real labor belonged to the artisans and workers who shaped them, fired them, moved them, and placed them in the earth. Many of those workers remain unnamed, but their hands are everywhere in the tomb. The emperor searched for immortality, but the memory that survived him was made by mortal hands. His final years were marked by tours across the empire, perhaps to inspect, perform rituals, display authority, and seek signs of cosmic support. He traveled through the land he had unified, a ruler trying to make his presence felt across distances no Chinese king before him had controlled so completely. But in 210 BCE, during one of these journeys, Qin Shi Huang died. His death created immediate danger. A state built around absolute authority can become fragile when that authority disappears. Court politics turned secretive and tense. Li Si and the eunuch Zhao Gao became involved in the succession crisis. The emperor's chosen heir was reportedly pushed aside, and a younger son, Hu Hai, became the second emperor. The new ruler lacked his father's force. The court became unstable, and Zhao Gao gained destructive influence. The empire Qin Shi Huang had built still looked powerful from the outside. Its roads remained, its laws remained, its officials remained, its armies remained, but resentment had been gathering beneath the surface. Conquered peoples remembered their lost states. Laborers hated the burdens placed on them. Farmers suffered under taxes and service. Nobles who had lost status waited for weakness. The harshness that had made Qin strong now made it brittle. Rebellion began soon after. One famous uprising started when conscripted men, delayed by rain and facing punishment for arriving late, decided that if they were to die either way, they might as well rebel. Whether every detail of the story is exact or shaped by later memory, its meaning is clear. A system of severe punishment can produce obedience for a time, but when people feel they have nothing left to lose, fear can turn into revolt. Across the empire, uprisings spread. Old regional identities returned. Men claimed the names of former states. Leaders emerged from unexpected backgrounds. The empire that had taken generations of Qin discipline to build began to unravel within only a few years of the first emperor's death. By 206 BCE, the Qin dynasty had collapsed. Its fall was shockingly fast. And yet, Qin did not fail completely. This is one of the most important truths in Chinese history. The Qin dynasty itself was brief, but the imperial model it created endured. Later, rulers condemned Qin's cruelty, but they kept much of its structure. Centralized administration commanderies in counties, standardized systems, written bureaucracy, imperial title, and the idea of one unified realm under one sovereign all survived in new forms. Qin was both a warning and a foundation. It showed that China could be unified. It showed how powerful a centralized state could become. It also showed that order without mercy could destroy itself. The dynasty burned hot, changed everything, and vanished almost as quickly as it had risen. As we leave the first emperor's world, the image that remains is not simple. There is the road stretching from the capital into distant provinces. There is the wall running across harsh northern land. There are bamboo texts hidden from fire. There are farmers called to labor far from home. There are officials writing in a standardized script. There is a ruler searching for immortality while his own body grows weaker. And beneath the soil, there is an army of clay standing in silence, still guarding a man who could conquer kingdoms, but not time. The Qin Empire ended, but it left behind the shape of empire itself. From its ruins, a new dynasty would rise. It would inherit Qin's unified state, but learn from Qin's mistakes. It would keep central authority while softening the harshest edges. It would blend law with moral language bureaucracy, with Confucian ideals and conquest, with continuity. That dynasty would be the Han. And under the Han, the empire Qin created would begin to feel less like a sudden command and more like a civilization finding its lasting form. The Han Golden Age. The Han Dynasty did not become great all at once. It began in recovery with tired fields, damaged roads, unsettled borders, and a people who had lived through the fall of Qin and the wars that followed. Liu Bang, the founder of Han, had understood that an empire could not be held by fear alone. His dynasty kept much of Qin's administrative structure, but softened its harshest edges. Taxes were reduced, labor demands were eased, and the people were given time to return to the slow work of farming, rebuilding, and living. That quieter beginning mattered. A dynasty that wants to last must first allow the land to breathe. For several generations, Han rulers worked to stabilize the empire. They faced threats from regional kings, powerful families, court factions, and the northern frontier. They inherited Qin's unified world, but had to make unity feel natural rather than forced. Slowly, through policy compromise, administration, and patience, the Han state settled into a more durable shape. Its capital, Chang'an, became the heart of this world. Chang'an was not only a political center. It was a place where roads met officials, gathered merchants, traded envoys, arrived, and imperial authority took visible form. From its gates, commands traveled outward to distant commanderies and counties. Grain reports, taxes, soldiers, and goods moved along the roads that connected the capital to the wider realm. The city stood as a symbol of order after centuries of fragmentation. In the streets and markets of Chang'an, the empire could be felt in motion. Merchants brought goods from different regions. Artisans worked with metal, wood, silk, lacquer, and clay. Officials moved through offices where records were kept on bamboo, wood, and later paper. Nobles and wealthy families lived in walled compounds. Common workers carried loads, repaired buildings, tended animals, and served the needs of a growing capital. The city was not quiet in the way a village was quiet. It had the deeper murmur of administration, trade, ritual, and ambition. Yet, even at the height of Han greatness, the empire rested on the countryside. Most people were farmers. They worked fields of millet, wheat, rice, beans, and other crops depending on region and climate. Their lives were shaped by the same ancient concerns that had guided villagers for thousands of years: rain-soil tools, family illness taxes, and the timing of the seasons. The emperor might sit in Chang'an, but the strength of the dynasty grew from harvests gathered far beyond the capital walls. A Han farmer lived inside two worlds at once. One was immediate and familiar: the field near his home, the family altar, the village path, the animals, the tools, the storage jars, the changing weather. The other was larger and more distant: the empire that counted households, collected taxes, demanded labor, and offered protection in return. He might never see the emperor, but the emperor's state reached him through officials' laws, coinage, roads, and obligations. This connection between village and empire was one of Han's greatest achievements. Qin had created a centralized system, but Han made that system more livable. The dynasty kept counties, officials, registers, and laws, yet gradually dressed the state in a moral language that Qin had lacked. Over time, Confucian ideals became increasingly important in court life and government. The state still needed law and punishment, but it also wanted to speak of virtue, education, ritual, family duty, and humane rule. This blending became the foundation of imperial China. Legalist methods remained beneath the surface. The government still counted, taxed, judged, punished, and organized. But Confucian thought gave the state a softer and more respected face. It taught that rulers should govern with moral responsibility. Officials should cultivate learning and integrity. Children should honor parents, and society should be ordered through proper relationships. Han did not become purely Confucian, but it made Confucianism central to the ideal image of government. This change became especially important under Emperor Wu of Han. Emperor Wu, who ruled from 141 to 87 BCE, was one of the most powerful and ambitious rulers in Chinese history. Under him, the Han Dynasty reached a new level of expansion, confidence, and cultural definition. He strengthened central authority, reduced the independence of regional kings, expanded the empire's frontiers, promoted Confucian learning, and pushed Han influence far beyond the old heartland. His reign was brilliant, but also demanding. Like many strong rulers, he brought both glory and burden. One of the great challenges of the Han was the Xiongnu, a powerful confederation of nomadic peoples on the northern frontier. The relationship between Han and Xiongnu was complex. There was warfare, diplomacy, trade, marriage, alliance, tribute, and constant negotiation. To the Han court, the northern frontier was both a danger and a doorway. It was the edge of the settled agricultural empire, but beyond it lay steppe worlds that could not be ignored. Early Han rulers had often tried to manage the Xiongnu through diplomacy and marriage alliances. Emperor Wu chose a more aggressive path. He sent armies north and west. He sought powerful horses, better frontier defense, and control over routes that led into Central Asia. These campaigns were costly. Soldiers marched across difficult landscapes. Horses, grain, and supplies had to be moved over long distances. Families in the interior felt the pressure through taxes and service. Yet the result was a dramatic expansion of Han influence. Through these Western campaigns, the Han opened stronger connections with Central Asia. This is where the story of the Silk Road begins to enter Chinese history. The Silk Road was not one single road, and it was not created in one moment. It was a network of routes crossing deserts, mountains, oases, and trading towns. Goods moved in stages from one people to another. Silk traveled westward. Horses, glass, precious stones, metals, plants, and ideas moved eastward. Merchants, envoys, monks, soldiers, and guides all played their part in connecting lands that had once seemed impossibly far apart. For the Han, these routes were strategic as well as commercial. Good horses from Central Asia were highly valued because they strengthened the army, especially against steppe cavalry. Envoys brought information about distant kingdoms. Trade enriched certain regions. The empire began to imagine itself not only as the center of the old Chinese world, but as part of a wider map, stretching toward Persia, India, and even the edges of the Mediterranean world. The journey west was not easy. Caravans crossed dry basins and dangerous passes. Oases became precious points of survival. Travelers measured distance not only by road, but by watershade safety and the trustworthiness of local guides. A bolt of silk might pass through many hands before reaching a distant buyer. A horse brought east might carry with it the labor of breeders, traders, translators, guards, and officials. In this way, the Han Empire became more connected. Not suddenly, not completely, but steadily. Ideas also moved along these routes. Buddhism, which had begun in India centuries earlier, slowly entered China through Central Asian connections, especially during the later Han period. At first, it was one teaching among many unfamiliar and foreign. Over time, it would become one of the most important religious traditions in Chinese history. But in the Han Golden Age, its arrival was still quiet, like a small lamp carried along a long road. The Han world was also an age of invention and technical skill. Paper, traditionally associated with improvements made by Kai Lun in the Eastern Han, transformed the way knowledge could be recorded and transmitted. Before paper became widespread, writing was often done on bamboo slips, wooden tablets, silk, or other materials. Bamboo was durable but heavy. Silk was light but expensive. Paper offered a more practical medium, and over time, it would change administration, literature, education, and memory itself. The importance of paper is easy to underestimate. A state depends on records. A culture depends on texts. A family may depend on contracts, letters, rituals, and written memory. When writing becomes easier to produce and store, ideas travel farther. Officials can keep more detailed accounts. Scholars can copy more works. History can be preserved with greater flexibility. Paper did not create Chinese civilization, but it gave that civilization a new surface on which to continue itself. Han advances also appeared in metallurgy, agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and engineering. Iron tools became more widely used, helping farmers work the soil more effectively. Steel production improved. Water-powered devices and mechanical ingenuity supported production in some areas. Astronomers observed the sky, carefully refining calendars that were essential for ritual and agriculture. A proper calendar was not only a scientific tool, it helped align the human world with seasonal and cosmic order. Medicine developed through herbal knowledge, acupuncture, pulse diagnosis, and theories of balance in the body. The Han imagination saw the human body, the state, and the cosmos as connected through patterns of harmony and imbalance. Health was not only the absence of illness, it was the proper movement of forces within a living system. This way of thinking fit deeply with broader Chinese ideas about balance, rhythm, and correspondence between different levels of reality. Even the earth itself was being studied. In the Eastern Han, the scholar Zhang Heng created a famous seismoscope, a device said to detect the direction of distant earthquakes. Whether we think of it as early science, technical curiosity, or courtly ingenuity, it shows the Han interest in observing and understanding the natural world. The empire wanted signs from the heavens, from the earth, from texts, from ritual, and from history. History became especially important during the Han. The great historian Sima Qian, who lived during the Western Han, created one of the most influential historical works ever written in China, the Records of the Grand Historian. His work traced the past from ancient legends through dynasties, rulers, families, states, and notable individuals. He gave shape to Chinese historical memory in a way that later historians would follow for centuries. Sima Qian's own life was marked by suffering. After defending a disgraced general, he offended Emperor Wu and was punished severely. Yet he chose to live and complete his history rather than die before finishing the work inherited from his father. There is something deeply moving in this choice. A man wounded by power continued to write about power. He preserved the memory of rulers, rebels, ministers, assassins, merchants, philosophers, and forgotten turning points, creating a work large enough to hold many kinds of human life. Through Sima Qian, history became more than a list of rulers. It became a moral landscape. He showed that the past was filled with ambition, loyalty, betrayal, wisdom, failure, courage, and irony. He understood that dynasties rise and fall, but human character remains the thread by which events become meaningful. Later, China would owe much of its historical imagination to the way he arranged memory. Confucian learning grew stronger in this world. The Han court established institutions for the study of classical texts. Officials were increasingly expected to know the Confucian classics and understand the moral language of governance. This was not yet the full imperial examination system of later dynasties, but the roots were there. Education became a path, at least for some men, into government service. The scholar official began to emerge as one of the central figures of Chinese civilization. This did not mean society became truly open to everyone. Wealth, family background, local status, and access to education still mattered greatly. A poor peasant's son could not easily become an official without resources and support. But the ideal of merit through learning became powerful. It suggested that rule should depend not only on birth or military strength, but on cultivated knowledge and moral discipline. For families, this gave education a sacred weight. A son who studied might raise the honor of his ancestors. A household that produced an official could rise in status. Books, teachers, memory, and discipline became linked to family ambition. The Confucian state did not remove hierarchy, but it gave hierarchy an educational path and a moral vocabulary. Women's lives in the Han were shaped mainly by family roles, marriage weaving, household labor, and expectations of obedience within a patriarchal order. Yet some women became visible in history. Empresses, empress dowagers, court women, and scholars could influence events. Banjia, one of the most famous learned women of the Han, completed the historical work of her family and wrote lessons for women that reflected the values and limits of her age. Her presence reminds us that even within restrictive structures, women participated in the making and preserving of culture. The daily life of the Han was varied. In the countryside, houses were built of earthwood, thatch, or brick, depending on region and wealth. Families cooked grains, vegetables, meat when available, and fermented foods. They worshipped ancestors, celebrated seasonal festivals, and made offerings at household or local shrines. Farmers worried about taxes and weather. They also worried about debt, land loss, sickness, and the demands of powerful families. In towns and cities, life had a different texture. Markets brought together merchants, craftsmen, entertainers, officials, and travelers. Goods from distant regions could appear beside local products. Silk workshops, iron production, lacquerware, pottery, and other crafts supported both daily use and elite luxury. Wealthy households owned land, servants, and fine goods. Their tombs were furnished with models of houses, animals, servants' wells, granaries, and kitchens, as if the afterlife should preserve the comforts and order of earthly life. Han tombs tell us much about imagination. They show people wanting continuity beyond death, just as Shang kings had filled tombs with bronze and sacrificial power. Han elites often filled tombs with objects and models that reflected daily abundance, miniature farms, tower stoves, musicians, animals, and servants made of clay. The afterlife became in some ways a continuation of household order. Death did not erase the desire for comfort, status, and familiar surroundings. Ancestor worship remained central. Families honored those who came before them with offerings, remembrance, and ritual care. The dead were part of the moral structure of the family. To neglect ancestors was to weaken the bond between generations. To honor them was to place oneself inside a chain that stretched backward into memory and forward into descendants yet unborn. This sense of continuity helped Han's civilization feel stable. A dynasty could be vast, but family ritual made order intimate. The emperor sacrificed to heaven and earth on behalf of the realm. A village family offered food and respect to its ancestors on behalf of the household. The pattern repeated at different scales: empire, community, family, body, cosmos. All were imagined as needing balance. Still, the Han Golden Age was not without suffering. Emperor Wu's campaigns and projects were expensive. Taxes and monopolies placed burdens on the people. Military expansion brought glory, but also loss. Court politics could be dangerous. Officials competed for influence. Powerful families accumulated land. Some peasants fell into debt and became tenants or dependents. The same dynasty, remembered for brilliance, also contained the seeds of later trouble. This is important to remember. A golden age is rarely golden for everyone. For the court, Han expansion looked like grandeur. For a soldier on the frontier, it might feel like cold wind distance and longing for home. For a merchant, the Silk Road could mean profit and wonder. For a farmer, imperial campaigns could mean heavier taxes. For a scholar, Confucian learning opened paths to honor. For those without access to education, the world remained bounded by labor. Yet, despite these tensions, the Han Dynasty created a powerful and lasting model of civilization. It showed that a unified empire could endure beyond one ruler's terror. It gave the state a Confucian moral language. It expanded China's horizons westward. It strengthened writing, administration, historical memory, and education. It developed technologies and institutions that later dynasties would inherit. Most importantly, it gave the people of the empire a name that would endure. The majority ethnic group in China would come to call themselves Han. This is a sign of how deeply the dynasty entered identity. Qin unified the land, but Han gave the unified civilization a lasting cultural shape. To be Han came to mean more than living under one dynasty. It became a way of remembering language, history, family structure, ritual, and shared civilization. As the Han world matured, one can imagine the empire at evening. In Chang'an, lamps begin to glow in official buildings as clerks finish records. In a market street, merchants close stalls after a day of bargaining. Somewhere on the frontier, a soldier looks across open land toward the north. Along a western route, a caravan rests near an oasis, its silk bundles guarded through the night. In a village far from the capital, a family shares a simple meal while smoke rises from the roof and the ancestors are remembered with quiet gestures. All of these lives belong to the Han world. The empire is not only the emperor. It is the road and the field, the book and the tax register, the silk and the plow, the frontier watchtower and the family altar. It is the confidence of a court that believes it governs all under heaven and the patience of ordinary people who make that belief possible through daily labor. The Han Golden Age would become one of the great reference points of Chinese history. Later dynasties would look back to it as a model of power, culture, and order. Scholars would preserve its texts. Families would remember its name. The routes it opened would continue to shape exchange across Asia. The political and moral framework it strengthened would guide imperial government for centuries. But no golden age remains untouched by time. The same forces that helped Han grow strong would slowly create problems. Powerful families accumulated land. Court factions struggled for control. Eunuchs and imperial relatives competed around young emperors. Taxes and military demands weighed on the countryside. Natural disasters shook confidence. Religious movements and peasant unrest began to rise. The Han had given China one of its most enduring forms. Yet even this dynasty, so admired and long-lasting, would eventually face the old rhythm of history: prosperity, strain, imbalance, and decline. For now, though, we leave it in its brightness. The roads are open. Chang'an is alive. Silk moves westward. Scholars study the classics. Historians write the past into order. Farmers continue the work that sustains everything. And over the long memory of China, the name Han begins to settle, like a deep mark, one that would remain long after the dynasty itself had passed into history. The slow decline of Han. For a long time, the Han Dynasty seemed to have found the form that Qin had failed to hold. It had inherited the unity of empire, but softened it with patience. It had kept laws, officials, records, roads, taxes, and commanderies, yet wrapped them in the language of virtue learning, family duty, and moral government. It had opened routes toward Central Asia, strengthened the capital, supported scholarship, and given Chinese civilization one of its most enduring names. But even a long and brilliant dynasty carries strain within it. The Han Golden Age had been built on balance. The ruler needed officials, but officials could become corrupt. The court needed powerful families, but powerful families could grow too strong. The empire needed taxes, soldiers, and labor, but the countryside could only bear so much. The state needed land-holding farmers, yet over time, many small farmers lost their land to wealthier families. The system could still appear stable from the capital, while in the villages, pressure gathered quietly. This is how dynasties often begin to decline. Not always through one sudden disaster. More often, the decline begins with small changes that repeat for generations. A wealthy family buys another field. A poor farmer borrows grain after a bad harvest. A tax collector arrives when the storage jars are already low. A young emperor comes to the throne before he is old enough to rule strongly. A court faction gains influence. An official accepts a favor. A frontier campaign costs more than expected. A flood ruins villages in one province, while the court continues its ceremonies in another. Each event may seem survivable. Together, they make the dynasty tired. After the height of Western Han power, the court faced increasing difficulty managing the same forces that had once made the empire great. Expansion had brought prestige, but it had also brought cost. Frontier defense required soldiers, horses, supplies, and careful diplomacy. Roads and garrisons needed maintenance. Officials had to be paid. The capital had to be supplied. Rituals, palaces, and court life consumed wealth. Beneath all of this, the farmer remained the base of the empire. When farmers were secure, the dynasty could breathe. When farmers became desperate, the entire order began to weaken. One of the deepest problems was land concentration. In theory, the Han state valued the independent peasant household. Such households worked the soil, paid taxes, provided labor service, and supplied soldiers. They were the foundation of the imperial system. But over time, wealthy landowners and powerful families accumulated more and more land. Poorer farmers, especially after flood, drought, illness, debt, or tax pressure, could be forced to sell their fields. Once a farmer lost his land, his relationship to the state changed. He might become a tenant on land owned by a great family. He might work as a dependent laborer. He might flee. He might try to survive outside the official registers. For the state, this was dangerous. A peasant who owned land could be taxed directly. A peasant absorbed into a powerful estate might become harder for the government to reach. Wealthy families gained people fields and influence, while the court slowly lost control over its own base. The empire remained large, but its roots were being pulled into private hands. This did not happen everywhere in the same way, and it did not ruin the Han overnight, but it created a long-term weakness. Great families became more independent. Local officials might come from or depend upon such families. In some regions, the authority of the state passed through private networks before it reached ordinary people. The emperor still ruled all under heaven in theory, but in practice power was becoming uneven. Court politics added another layer of instability. In a dynasty that lasted for centuries, not every emperor could be strong. Some came to the throne as children. Some died young. Some depended heavily on relatives, regents, empress dowagers, consort families, or palace insiders. Around the throne, influence became a prize. Families related to the emperor through marriage could gain extraordinary power. Eunuchs inside the palace could also become influential because they controlled access information and daily service near the ruler. These struggles were not merely personal. When factions controlled the court policy, could become unstable. Good officials might be dismissed. Corrupt ones might be protected. Decisions could be shaped by rivalry rather than the needs of the people. A young emperor might sit at the center of the world and still be surrounded by people who used his name for their own purposes. The Han court, like many imperial courts after it, could be both magnificent and fragile. From the outside, rituals continued. Officials bowed. Documents moved through offices. Envoys arrived. Sacrifices were performed. The calendar was maintained. The emperor's title still carried cosmic meaning. But behind the forms, the real ability to govern depended on the quality of people around the throne. When they served well, the empire held. When they served themselves, cracks widened. The first great break came with Wang Mang. Wang Mang was a powerful official connected to the imperial family. In 9 CE, he took the throne, and founded a new dynasty called Qin. He presented himself as a reformer, someone who would restore ancient ideals and correct the problems that had weakened Han rule. His reforms were ambitious. He tried to address land inequality, slavery currency, and state control over economic life. He looked backward to the Zhou classics for moral authority, hoping to reshape the empire according to a vision of restored order. But reform is not easy when society is already strained. Wang Mong's policies disrupted many interests. Some reforms were difficult to enforce. Currency changes created confusion. Powerful families resisted. Natural disasters made conditions worse. The Yellow River shifted and flooded, bringing misery to large areas. Peasant suffering deepened and rebellion spread. Wang Mong had tried to restore order through sweeping change, but the world around him became more unstable. His dynasty collapsed in 23 CE. The Han name, however, had not lost all power. Members of the Liu imperial family and their supporters rose during the rebellions. In 25 CE, Liu Shu restored Han rule and became Emperor Guangwu, beginning what historians call the Eastern Han. The capital eventually settled at Luoyang rather than Chang'an. The dynasty had been interrupted but not razed. The restoration of Han was a remarkable achievement. It showed how deeply the name Han had settled into political memory. After Wang Mong's failure, returning to Han rule seemed to many like returning to legitimacy. The restored dynasty could claim continuity with the past while also promising renewal after disorder. Emperor Guangwu worked to rebuild stability, reduce burdens, strengthen administration, and recover from years of chaos. For a time, Eastern Han succeeded. The empire regained order. Agriculture recovered in many regions. Officials resumed their work. The court revived rituals and institutions. Scholars continued to study the classics. The Han world, though changed, still carried the weight of its earlier greatness. But the problems that had weakened Western Han did not vanish completely. Powerful families remained influential. Land concentration continued. Court factions returned. Eunuchs and relatives of empresses again competed for control, especially when emperors were young or weak. The bureaucracy could still produce capable men, but corruption and favoritism were constant dangers. The dynasty had been restored, but restoration did not mean the clock had been turned back. The Eastern Han also faced frontier pressures. The Xiongnu and other groups beyond the borders continued to shape Han military and diplomatic policy. Some campaigns succeeded, and Han influence in the western regions could expand or contract, depending on the strength of the court. But frontier defense was costly and distant control was difficult. The empire was large enough to command awe, but also large enough to be hard to manage. In the countryside, the lives of ordinary people remained vulnerable. A good harvest could bring temporary comfort. A bad one could lead to death. A flood could destroy not only crops, but the fragile independence of a household. Drought could empty storage jars before winter. Locusts could turn a year's labor into hunger. Taxes and obligations did not always disappear when nature failed. If local officials were harsh or corrupt, suffering deepened. Natural disasters carried political meaning in the Han worldview. Floods, droughts, earthquakes, strange weather, and celestial events were not seen only as natural occurrences. They could be interpreted as warnings from heaven. Since the emperor was responsible for maintaining harmony between heaven, earth, and human society, disasters could suggest that something was wrong in the realm. A wise ruler might respond by issuing reforms, reducing taxes, changing officials, or performing rituals of repentance. This connection between nature and politics may decline, feel cosmic. When the people suffered and disasters multiplied, many began to believe that the dynasty's virtue had weakened. The old idea of the mandate of heaven had not disappeared. It remained in the background like a silent measure. If the Han could no longer protect the people, if its officials exploited them, if its court became corrupt, then people might begin to wonder whether heaven still favored the Liu house. Religious movements grew in this atmosphere of uncertainty. Taoist-inspired teachings, healing practices, talismans, communal rituals, and hopes for renewal spread among suffering communities. These movements were not only spiritual. They often answered practical despair. When official institutions failed to protect people, religious leaders could offer healing, belonging, explanation, and hope. For peasants facing hunger, debt, and disease, a promise of cosmic change could feel more real than the distant authority of the court. The most famous of these movements led to the Yellow Turban Rebellion. In 184 CE, followers of Zhang Jue and his brothers rose across parts of the empire. They were associated with a Taoist-inspired healing and millenarian movement called the Way of Great Peace. Their slogan expressed the belief that one cosmic age had ended and another was beginning. They wore yellow headscarves, giving the rebellion its name. The Yellow Turban Rebellion was not simply a military revolt. It was a sign of deep illness in the empire. Hundreds of thousands of peasants and followers joined uprisings across different regions. They were not only fighting officials, they were expressing a belief that the existing order had lost its right to continue. Hunger, exploitation, disease, religious hope, and political anger joined together. The court responded with military force, calling on generals and local authorities to suppress the rebellion. The rebellion was eventually crushed, but suppression did not heal the dynasty. In fact, the effort to defeat the Yellow Turbans gave enormous power to regional military leaders. The central government, already weakened by factional struggles, had to rely on commanders who could raise troops and restore order in the provinces. Once these men gained armies, followers, and local bases, they became difficult to control. The dynasty survived the rebellion in name, but its dependence on warlords changed everything. This is one of the turning points of late Han history. A strong dynasty can use generals without being ruled by them. A weak dynasty creates generals who become powers in their own right. After the Yellow Turban crisis, local commanders, governors, and military families began to dominate regions. Some still claimed loyalty to Han. Some acted in the emperor's name, but their real strength came from armies, land, and personal networks. The court itself descended into further chaos. Eunuchs and officials fought for influence. In 189 CE, after the death of Emperor Ling, court conflict became violent. The general He Jin attempted to eliminate the eunuchs, but was killed. In response, soldiers entered the palace and the eunuch faction was massacred. Amid the disorder, the warlord Dong Zhuo seized control of the capital and took command of the young emperor. The Han Emperor became a hostage of power. Dong Zhuo's control shocked the realm. He deposed one emperor, placed another on the throne, burned and looted, and moved the capital from Luoyang to Chang'an. His behavior provoked opposition from regional warlords who formed coalitions against him. Yet, even resistance to Dong Zhuo did not restore Han unity. Instead, it revealed that the empire had become a field of competing military powers. The emperor still existed. The dynasty's name still mattered. But the real authority of Han had largely broken apart. In this late period, one can imagine the sadness of the old order. The court rituals continued in some form, but their power was hollow. Officials still used the language of loyalty, but many served local strongmen. Soldiers marched under banners claiming to rescue the dynasty, while also expanding their own influence. The people already worn by rebellion and disaster now faced the movements of armies across a fractured land. For a village family, the end of Han may not have been a single date. It may have felt like years of uncertainty, a taxed demand from one authority, then another, a road unsafe because troops had passed through, a son taken by a local army, a market disrupted, a rumor that the emperor had been moved, a harvest hidden from soldiers. A family altar still tended in the hope that ancestors might protect the household even when the empire no longer could. This is how imperial collapse becomes personal. Not through the disappearance of a title, but through the loss of predictability. The Han had once given the world a sense of broad order. It had connected capital and village frontier, and court silk road and family altar. By the late 2nd century, that order had frayed. The name remained, but the fabric had torn in too many places. Still, decline is not only an ending, it is also the beginning of new stories. Out of the late Han disorder, powerful figures emerged. Cao Cao in the north would become one of the most important military and political leaders of the age. Sun Quan's family would build strength in the southeast. Liu Bei, claiming descent from the Han imperial house, would gather followers around a dream of restoration. Around them stood advisors, generals, scholars, and soldiers whose lives would later become part of one of China's most famous historical legends. The fall of Han led toward the Three Kingdoms. But before that age fully begins, we should understand what had been lost. Han was not merely a dynasty of emperors. It was the form in which imperial China first learned endurance. It shaped government, identity, history, education, ritual expansion, and memory. Its decline therefore felt larger than one ruling family's weakness. It felt like the weakening of a world that had seemed permanent. Yet no world is permanent. The same rivers that had watched villages become kingdoms, and kingdoms become empire, now watched the empire divide again. The Yellow River still carried silt, the fields still needed planting, families still honored ancestors, the classics were still copied. Stories were still told. Even when dynasties fail, civilization does not vanish in a single night. It breaks, adapts, remembers, and continues through those who survive the breaking. As the Han Dynasty entered its final years, the old rhythm of Chinese history returned. A house that had once claimed heaven's favor had grown burdened by corruption, inequality, disaster, and rebellion. The people suffered. Regional powers rose. The emperor's authority weakened until it could be used by others more than exercised by himself. The mandate of heaven, though not always spoken directly, seemed to tremble over the age. The Han name would endure, but Han rule would not. In the next part of the story, we enter the world born from its collapse, the age of warlords, shifting loyalties, tragic heroes, brilliant strategists, and three rival kingdoms. It was a time of suffering, but also of unforgettable human drama, when history began to pass into legend and the memory of the Han became something men would fight to inherit, restore, or replace. The Three Kingdoms and the memory of Han. When the Han Dynasty weakened beyond repair, it did not disappear in a single quiet moment. Its name remained. Its emperor still existed. Officials still spoke of loyalty, duty, and the old order. Rituals could still be performed, documents could still carry imperial language, and ambitious men could still claim that they acted for the sake of restoring Han authority. But beneath those surviving forms, real power had moved elsewhere. It had moved to generals, governors, regional commanders, and warlords who controlled armies of their own. The late Han world was tired. Rebellions had shaken the countryside. Court factions had torn the palace apart. Powerful families had gathered land and influence. Disasters had weakened faith in the dynasty's virtue. The Yellow Turban Rebellion had been suppressed, but the effort to defeat it had raised local military leaders to a strength the court could no longer easily command. The emperor, once the center of the realm, became increasingly dependent on men who claimed to protect him while using his name for their own power. This was the world from which the three kingdoms emerged. It was not yet three kingdoms at first. It was a landscape of many competing forces, each trying to survive and expand as the Han order collapsed around them. Alliances formed, broke, and formed again. Governors became independent. Generals gathered followers. Old loyalties mixed with new ambitions. Some men claimed to defend the dynasty. Others spoke more quietly and built power without pretending to serve anyone but themselves. Among these figures, Cao Cao rose in the north. Cao Cao is one of the most complex figures in Chinese history. Later literature often painted him as cunning, ruthless, and suspicious, a man whose intelligence made him dangerous. Yet history also shows him as a capable administrator, a gifted strategist, and a leader who understood how to restore order in places broken by war. He did not simply command armies. He rebuilt agriculture, organized military colonies, gathered scholars, and controlled the Han Emperor in a way that gave his actions the appearance of legitimacy. To hold the emperor was to hold the name of Han. Cao Cao understood this. By bringing the emperor under his protection, he could issue commands in the emperor's name. His enemies could be described as rebels against Han, even when they saw themselves as resisting Cao Cao's domination. This gave him a powerful political advantage. He did not need to declare the dynasty dead. He could use its surviving authority while building his own. In the north, where war had left many regions damaged, Cao Cao worked to restore production. Military colonies helped feed armies and resettle displaced people. Grain became as important as soldiers. A commander who could not feed his men could not hold territory for long. Cao Cao's strength came from understanding that power rested not only on battlefield victories, but also on administration, logistics, and the ability to make exhausted land useful again. Yet his rise also created fear. To some, he was the only man strong enough to restore order. To others, he was the man who had taken the Han Emperor captive in all but name. This ambiguity would follow his memory for centuries. He could be seen as both savior and usurper restorer, and destroyer statesman and villain. The age itself made such contradictions possible. Far to the southeast, another power was forming around the lower Yangtze River. This was the House of Sun. Sun Jian, then Sun Ci, and later Sun Quan, built a strong base in the south and southeast. The land there was different from the northern plains. Rivers, lakes, wetlands, and access to maritime routes shaped its strength. Control of water mattered deeply. Armies in the north might move across open land, but in the southeast boats, river defenses and naval skill could decide survival. Sun Quan inherited a young but promising regime. He had to hold together local elites, military commanders, river defenses, and a territory that still required consolidation. Unlike Cao Cao, he did not control the Han Emperor. Unlike Liu Bei, he did not become famous through a claim of restoring Han legitimacy. His strength lay in holding the southeast with patience, balancing families and generals, and making the Yangtze a shield against northern conquest. Then there was Liu Bei. Liu Bei's power was smaller for much of his life, but his memory became enormous. He claimed descent from the Han imperial family, and this claim gave his cause emotional weight. In an age where the Han name still mattered, Liu Bei could present himself as a loyal kinsman of the old dynasty, someone fighting not only for territory, but for restoration. His early life was difficult. He wandered lost bases, sought allies, and often seemed close to failure. Yet he continued to attract loyalty. Later tradition remembered him as humane, sincere, and deeply committed to righteous rule. Whether history was more complicated than legend does not remove the power of that image. Liu Bei became the figure of the struggling loyalist, the man who lacked the greatest resources but carried the moral memory of Han. His most famous advisor was Zhuge Liang. Zhuge Liang became one of the great symbols of wisdom in Chinese culture. In history, he was a statesman, strategist, administrator, and loyal servant of Liu Bei, and later, Liu Bei's son. In legend, he became almost superhuman in intelligence, able to read men, weather terrain, and the hidden movement of events. Stories turned him into the perfect advisor, calm amid confusion and faithful even when success was uncertain. The meeting between Liu Bei and Zhuge Liang became one of the cherished moments of later storytelling. Liu Bei, in need of guidance, was said to have visited Zhuge Liang 3 times before gaining his service. The image is gentle but meaningful, a ruler humbling himself before talent, seeking not merely a soldier, but a mind capable of seeing the whole age. Whether embellished or not, the story expresses an ideal that Chinese political culture valued deeply. A worthy ruler must know how to seek a worthy minister. As Cao Cao's power grew in the north, the question became whether he could reunify the land under his control. By 208 CE, he had brought much of northern China under his authority, and moved southward with a large force. If he could cross the Yangtze and defeat the southern powers, the age of division might end before it fully took shape. Sun Quan faced a grave decision. Should he submit, negotiate, or resist? Liu Bei, weakened but not defeated, also stood in the path of Cao Cao's ambition. The result was the Battle of Red Cliffs. Red Cliffs, fought along the Yangtze River, became one of the most famous battles in Chinese history. Cao Cao's northern forces were powerful, but they faced difficulties in the southern environment. His men were not as comfortable with river warfare. Disease supply problems and unfamiliar conditions weakened his position. The alliance between Sun Quan and Liu Bei used the river fire and timing to turn back the northern advance. The battle did not immediately create the three kingdoms, but it prevented Cao Cao from unifying China. That was its great importance. After Red Cliffs, the division of power became more durable. Cao Cao held the north. Sun Quan controlled the southeast. Liu Bei would eventually establish himself in the west, in the region of Shu protected by mountains and difficult terrain. The old Han world had fractured into three major centers. In 220 CE, after Cao Cao's death, his son Cao Pi formally ended the Han Dynasty and founded the state of Wei. This marked the official end of Han rule. The emperor abdicated, and the name that had shaped Chinese civilization for more than 4 centuries passed into history. But even then, the memory of Han did not vanish. Liu Bei soon declared himself Emperor of Shu Han, presenting his state as the continuation of the Han line. Sun Quan would later declare himself Emperor of Wu. The three kingdoms had fully emerged: Wei in the North Shu in the west and Wu in the southeast. Each kingdom carried a different character. Wei was the strongest in territory, population, and administrative inheritance. It controlled the old northern heartland and had the most direct connection to the institutions built by Cao Cao. It was powerful, organized, and positioned as the likely unifier. Shu was smaller and more isolated, based in Sichuan. Its mountains offered protection, and its claim to Han legitimacy gave it moral force. Under Zhuge Liang's guidance, Shu tried to survive against larger rivals, often launching northern campaigns in the hope of challenging Wei and restoring Han authority. Wu held the lower Yangtze and southeastern lands. Its strength came from river defenses, naval skill, regional resources, and political endurance. It was not always as ideologically dramatic as Shu or as administratively dominant as Wei, but it survived for many decades by making its geography work in its favor. For ordinary people, however, the age was difficult regardless of which kingdom ruled them. War did not remain on maps. It entered households through taxes, conscription, migration, and loss. Villages near contested regions could be emptied or fortified. Families could be separated. fields could be abandoned and later resettled. Soldiers spent years far from home, moving through landscapes where loyalty to a ruler might matter less than the next meal, the next order, or the hope of returning alive. Yet life continued even in division. Farmers planted when they could, officials collected records, families honored ancestors, markets reopened after campaigns passed, scholars served new courts. Craftsmen made tools, weapons, and household goods. Women held families together through long absences and uncertain harvests. Children grew up hearing the names of generals and rulers as part of the weather of their time. This is one reason the three kingdoms became so powerful in memory. It was not only an age of strategy and battle, it was an age where human qualities became sharply visible: loyalty, ambition, betrayal, patience, courage, wisdom, pride, and grief. Later generations could look at its figures and see moral types. Cao Cao became the brilliant and dangerous statesman. Liu Bei became the humane claimant to legitimacy. Sun Quan became the steady southern ruler. Guan Yu became the image of loyalty and martial honor. Zhang Fei became fierce courage. Zhuge Liang became devoted intelligence. History turned into legend because the age seemed to ask what kind of person survives when the world breaks apart. The literary tradition would later deepen this memory through romance of the three kingdoms written many centuries afterward. That novel transformed historical figures into cultural icons. It added speeches, scenes, strategies, emotions, and moral color that shaped how millions of people came to imagine the period. For many, the Three Kingdoms is not only a historical era, it is a world of stories, almost like a shared dream of loyalty and fate. But beneath the legend, the historical process continued. Shu was the first of the three to fall. In 263 CE, Wei conquered Shu, ending the state that had claimed to carry the Han legacy. Zhuge Liang had already died decades earlier, and without his presence later, Shu could not overcome its limitations. Its fall carried symbolic sadness because it seemed to close the last great effort to restore the Han name. Yet Wei itself did not enjoy final victory. Within Wei, the powerful Sima family had gained control. In 265 CE, Sima Yan forced the Wei emperor to abdicate and founded the Qin Dynasty. This pattern would have felt familiar in Chinese political memory: a ruling house weakened from within a powerful family, controlling the court, and finally, a formal transfer of the throne. The names changed, but the rhythm of dynastic replacement returned. The last kingdom to fall was Wu. In 280, CE, Jin forces conquered Wu and reunited China. Nearly a century after the effective collapse of Han authority, the land was once again brought under one dynasty. The Three Kingdoms period was over. But reunification did not erase the memory of division. The three kingdoms remained alive because it carried the emotional weight of an age when people still fought under the shadow of Han. It was an ending and an inheritance at the same time. The Han Dynasty had fallen, but men continued to invoke its name, restore its honor, or claim its authority. The empire broke, yet the idea of unity remained strong enough that every major power had to define itself in relation to it. This is one of the deepest continuities in Chinese history. Division could last for generations, but unity remained the imagined ideal. Even when the land was split between rival kingdoms, the language of all under heaven did not disappear. Each state existed inside a broader memory of wholeness. The question was not whether unity mattered, but who had the right and ability to restore it. As we come to the end of this chapter, the long arc of early Chinese history becomes visible. The story began with unnamed people moving through ancient landscapes before China had a name. It passed into villages beside rivers where millet and rice tied human life to soil and water. It moved through painted pottery black vessels, flood legends, the memory of Xia, the oracle bones of Shang, the mandate of heaven under Zhou, the fragmented world of spring and autumn, the harsh furnace of the warring states, the unification of Qin, and the long brilliance of Han. Now, with the three kingdoms, we see the empire break and memory take over. The historical Han ended, but the idea of Han remained powerful. The warriors and advisors of the age became stories told again and again, not only because they fought, but because they seemed to embody the human struggle inside history, the longing for order, the pain of loyalty, the danger of ambition, and the quiet knowledge that even the strongest houses eventually pass away. The Jin reunification in 280 CE closed one chapter, but Chinese history would continue through new periods of unity and division, northern and southern dynasties, Sui reunification, Tang brilliance, Song refinement, Mongol conquest, Ming restoration, Qing expansion, and the modern transformation still unfolding today. But those are later journeys. Tonight's journey has carried us from the earliest traces of human life to the end of the three kingdoms, from the first fires in ancient shelters to the legends of generals and strategists whose names still echo through Chinese culture. And through all of it, one pattern has remained. The land changes, rulers rise, dynasties fall, and the names of states are written and erased. But beneath those movements, people keep returning to the same human tasks, finding food, caring for family, honoring the dead, seeking order, remembering the past, and hoping that tomorrow will be calmer than today. Thank you for spending this quiet journey with me. If you enjoyed tonight's story, you can like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. It is always a small comfort to imagine all of us in different places under different skies, sharing the same slow road through history. For now let the names of the old dynasties fade softly into the background. Let the Yellow River and the Yangtze move quietly in your imagination. Let the bronze bells grow distant, the old roads empty, the palace lamps dim, and the fields rest beneath the night. Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders loosen. You have traveled far enough for tonight. Good night, my friends. Sleep well, and I will see you again in the next quiet journey.